the rationale for a community benefits agreement. Why should the city be asking developers for community benefits agreements, and why isn't the development itself a community benefit in terms of creating economic activity, jobs, spin-off businesses, opportunities in the neighborhoods?
I think it goes back to how do you define community? And I'm a big believer that developers are part of the community. And so not only does a community benefits process behoove, so quote unquote, the community, it also benefits developers. From all the developers I've talked to from my short time on council, if they knew from day one, this is what we're gonna have to do, they're like, okay, we're gonna build this into our pro forma, we're gonna figure out how we incorporate this to the extent that they can, and they're much more willing to work with folks. When you get thrown something, I think all of us can relate to this at the end when you've like finalized your application for a mortgage or for college or whatever, and it's like now you have this additional requirement, it makes it much more difficult for developers to comply, and I think then they resist at that point. So from both the development side as well as the community side, I've heard that yes, we're willing to come to the table and engage. It's really the process and how that happens, which is I think the challenge, and it's flawed with the current legislation that we have today. I think the other piece of it that's missing, and I speak about this very publicly on council as someone who's a third-generation Detroiter who grew up in poverty, that the conversation around economic development can't solely focus on creating jobs, because we know there's many people who are employed that are still living below the poverty line, and that there's other things, especially in my district, that have to do with air quality and health, access to transportation, like many folks have spoken about access to affordable housing. For me, those aren't benefits, those are minimums, those are standards that we should be fighting for as a local municipality. And anyone who comes to the table, it's like, hey, these are our values that we run and kind of guide ourselves as a city. If you're in alignment with those, we'd love to have you come. But if you're not, and you're going to displace people or create pollution or offer jobs that really aren't accessible to Detroiters, then maybe this isn't necessarily going to be the best partnership for us to engage with.
How do you manage the expectations of the community in terms of a business not be able to come in here and solve every problem, and convince businesses that investing in a community beyond their development is good for them?
Whenever there's a new expectation or a piece of new permitting requirement, as was the case with the community benefits ordinance, I think it takes time for people to say one of the major impediments to development is uncertainty, and so whenever there's a new thing introduced and no one's done it before, there's a lot of uncertainty. And I would certainly say that in the case of Ford and FC and some of the other larger ones, there's a lot of uncertainty because has this been done successfully with a large-scale project? So I think the uncertainty is a major point. I think once people understand what it takes to get your project fully permitted and entitled in a city, they make an economic decision about whether they're going to be able to do it or not. And they bake in and make assumptions about whether or not they're going to be able to meet the requirements of a CBO. We try to identify for them ways that the city and state, in some cases the federal government, can support them meeting the interests that the people in the community have identified. Sometimes projects, I bet you some projects are going to end up being a little bit smaller than they might have been. They might take a little bit longer than they might have. And again, I think the question is always, is the right balance being achieved? I think so far we've been able to do that, but again, it has come from working hard with the members of the council, working hard with people like Sheila, who led the NAC, from lots of volunteers and others who have been part of expressing their opinions at these meetings. It comes from the balance of keeping all those things together.
Councilwoman, Detroit's already a high-cost city to develop, and labor costs have jumped a third over the past couple of years.
That's true.
Do you have any worry that the CBO adds another layer of cost that might make the city non-competitive for the sort of developments you want to see here?
No, none at all. I think it's the lack of clarity and confusion that the current process creates. The thing is, the people who have been here in the city of Detroit have sustained the city. And there's benefits to developers coming in. There's a brand that internationally people kind of want to be a part of. This larger movement, the grit, the perseverance, whatever you use to describe that people want to come here. Now, financially, may it be more costly? Yes, I recognize that that's a reality. However, there are other benefits that you get by coming and investing in the city of Detroit. And I think too often we operate from this place of scarcity and from fear. And Chief Jemison knows this because I say this all the time. What would it look like to lead from a place of hope and working towards what we actually want to achieve versus being reactionary and responding and be like, oh, well, if we don't do this, they're not going to come here and we won't create these jobs. Versus, and I always think of Copenhagen as a great example in the EU, in a very different place now, but 20 years ago, they were on the verge of bankruptcy in a very similar situation to we are. They have built into their code and their policies the minimums kind of expectations of what they'd like to see developers come to the table with. Now, they're in a different position in terms of negotiating. However, they started from that place. And now when developers come, they know we have to include this amount of affordable housing, this amount of public space, this amount of access to public lighting. And if that was built in, I do think it would be a much easier conversation if it was institutionalized versus community after community having to negotiate.
So, Arthur, when you look at the concerns some of the folks here have had about affordable housing, I mean, that has to be a preoccupation of yours because you got a place like Corktown. I mean, the basic economic laws, supply and demand, are at work. Demand for housing goes up, supply stays relatively stagnant, prices go up. How do you assure that you have a community that's open to everybody?
Sure. So you do that by creating new housing and preserving existing affordable housing in communities. So this is an area, as you said, it's been a preoccupation. Since 2018, we have preserved 4,000 existing affordable housing units, and we have developed about 400 new affordable housing units. We've done that not only using our city and state resources and passing legislation with the help of the council that sets aside money that's made when we sell commercial property and puts it into deeply subsidized affordable housing. But in this case, in the Ford CBO, $2.5 million was allocated. It's going to be invested in preserving and creating new affordable housing in this community. And that money, because it's been committed by Ford and some of it's already been received, can be turned into to leverage state money through tax credits and others, and really double or triple its value in a development. So it's our plan to identify sites in the neighborhood where we can develop more affordable housing, using some of that land that belongs to the land bank, using some of the land that belongs to the city, and making sure that if there's existing, broken down housing, or even naturally occurring affordable housing, work with those owners to get those units preserved.
Go ahead.
I'm ignorant for the whole process, but I would like to ask about the availability of food. Is anything being done about ensuring that it's reasonably priced and supermarkets so that the folks that are in the areas can get to the food of any income level?
I don't think that there were specific requirements in any of the stuff that we've done that have to do with sort of healthy food and new supermarkets in the area. But I understand your concern, and I think there's...
I will say something separate that comes up in the conversations around community benefits and these larger deals is just access to the space in general, and access being more that I can physically be there, but are these spaces that are being created actually servicing my needs? And I think with Ford, we had conversations with them very honestly, like, yes, we'd like to see you open more retail, but do we really need another restaurant? I mean, people have nowhere to go to buy underwear or to buy their medicine or to maybe shop for local groceries. And I think each neighborhood is slightly different in terms of what they're missing in terms of basic neighborhood goods and services. But I think that's also part of the conversation is as companies come in and they are opening up retail space, how do they make sure it's affordable for local business owners and Detroit business owners specifically? And how do they make sure that the businesses that they're opening are actually servicing the need of the people in that community and they're not pricing overpriced so that people can actually buy the goods that they're selling?
Look out 10 years and tell me your ideal vision of Corktown.
Corktown, historically, this was a neighborhood of immigrants because immigrants and people of color could only live in certain places. So that sense of community, that sense of, I think, that work ethic, I would love to see preserved. And really, rather than focusing just on the core, which you see so many cities do around the world, really focusing on having almost like, small hubs. So each neighborhood you can walk, you can bike to church, to school, to grocery store, to the pharmacy, et cetera, and that you don't have to drive to some other destination to have your basic needs fulfilled.
Arthur, what do you see in this neighborhood in 2030?
In 2030, the good news is I see some similar things. I might describe them differently, but I really see people walking on Michigan and some of the streets leading up to Michigan and as a way of going to buy groceries, going to get their dry cleaning, doing the everyday things that we do in our lives. But the streets being a little bit, and this is going to sound controversial, but being a little bit busy. Like, oh, there's a lot of people on the street today.
I hope smoother, too, here.
Exactly. I also I imagine people walking in and out of and working in that building